It's difficult to imagine a time when massive, gargantuan SUVs didn't roam the American roads like tanks from an invading army. That's how I feel about these vehicles at this point, as I try to park my reasonably sized minivan that easily holds me, my wife, our 2 children, and our giant dog. Meanwhile, Susie takes up half the parking lot in her Escalade because she likes to feel above everyone else. The term SUV, or sport utility vehicle, did not exist all the way back in 1958 when the first sketches of what would become the International Scout were put to paper. International Harvester's decision to enter the off-road market, which was essentially owned and dominated by Jeep, was specifically a decision to make what they called a small 4x4 unit, essentially a small utility vehicle, an SUV. I know that's not what SUV means, but whatever. Now here's the thing about International Harvester, or IH as they're usually called. There are loads of companies throughout American history that have benefited from an environment ripe for business success. And then there are companies like International Harvester who helped to build that very environment in their 80 years making automobiles and everything agricultural. IH was one of those companies that were, and in many ways still are, the backbone of this country. So when IH set out to make a vehicle that you could comfortably, take to the drive-in, but then scare your date by literally jumping off the road, well, they nailed it. As the end of the 1950s rolled around, the automotive market was experiencing a massive shift. In the sport and touring segment, cars were becoming more usable, they featured more creature comforts, but thanks to the Jeep's post-war influence in off-road and adventure driving, as we could call it, there was a growing group of people who were interested in a sort of do-it-all vehicle. At this point, Jeep's iconic CJ5 was really in full swing, but that vehicle was little more than a military vehicle in civilian disguise. Fantastic off-road, sure, and even in water, oddly enough, but not exactly comfortable and certainly not what we would call an SUV. They had the sport part, but the utility and the comfort, not so much. Also, camping culture was taking off like crazy at this time, and the kind of vehicle that you could pack up and just go anywhere with really wasn't available. That was the hole that International was trying to fill with the Scout. But what they didn't realize was how this vehicle would create a new market altogether. Now, at the end of 1958, initial sketches of what would become the Scout were put to paper, and over the next 2 years, multiple designers would basically convene with their own takes on what this kind of vehicle could look like and how it could function. In many ways, the design that IH landed on was a big combination of all of those takes on the ultimate sport utility vehicle. Much of the credit for getting the Scout into production can go to someone named Ted Ornus. He was the vision behind the project, and without him, the tension between early designers of the Scout and the upper management at IH probably would have killed the project altogether. But he kind of just kept trucking along. And without him, maybe the SUV would have never been born, because without the Scout, there is no Wagoneer, there is no Blazer, and especially no Bronco. Like so many great but easily mass-produced vehicles and affordable vehicles throughout history, a brilliant simplicity would be the key to the Scout's design. The wheelbase was 100 inches. For reference, that's about the same as a first-generation Toyota Camry. It weighed about 2,500 pounds with nobody in it, and it was just about as cute a vehicle as there ever was. Essentially, it was just a small pickup though, but this small pickup was designed to be a versatile platform so that it could function as many things depending on what version of the Scout you bought and how you set it up. So it could be a truck, it could be a wagon, it could be a convertible. It was one of those vehicles that was really greater than the sum of its parts, as some people say. There really was nothing special here, but that versatility really lent itself to lots of uses in its day. Versatility was everything for this new vehicle, so you could get the Scout in travel top, hard top, sport top, soft top, and also cab top roofs. Again, all of this was built on what is essentially a little truck, but it could be used to, run down to the beach or plow snow, and just about everything in between. Many important industries utilize Scouts for various jobs. Now, in terms of the interior, it was enough. Basic, cheap, honestly, but compared to what Jeep had, God, it must have felt like a Cadillac. I think my favorite aspect of the first-gen Scout, though, is the engine. Originally, they considered importing an Austin B-Series engine, like what we see in the odd little Nash car, somewhat similar to the engine that's in my old MG Midget. Really, it was the same as what was in, for example, an MGA. But International had brought in a Jeep for testing, and when they used the B-Series in their Scout, it just wasn't making the kind of power that they needed it to for this package. I mean, those little British inline fours are fast, but they're not exactly torquey. They're sports car engines. So International decided to take a rather unique route. So the first gen Scout ended up with half of a V8 that was already in their lineup. So a V4, you say? No, see, you split the V8 the wrong way. This was literally IH's 304 cubic inch V8 split the long way. So a 152 cubic inch slanted inline 4, and that little engine really performed well. It made about 60 horsepower and had really good low-end torque. At this time, IH liked to give their models a number that was used to basically identify load capacity. For the first gen Scout, that load capacity was 800 pounds, so they called it the Scout 80, with specific models being things like the Ranger and the Commando and the Comanche. Early testers found that the Scout was, well, pretty surprising. More than just a Jeep copy. The ride was more comfortable, and in terms of what modern roads really needed and called for in the early 60s, the Scout proved to be very usable. Of course, today, early Scouts and Broncos and Jeeps that are really left stock, well, they struggle on today's highways. And they really can't keep up with even, my van, which makes like over 200 horsepower. But the real treat at the time for testers was seeing how it fared off-road. In short, it really handled whatever could be thrown at it. Hills, bumps, mud, whatever it was, this little 4x4 Scout could tackle it. Oh, except for rain. When it rained, it did leak a lot. And that was really the main complaint with early Scouts. But just to get a feel for the times and what a Scout could be used for, check out this excerpt from Car Life's road test for the all-new Scout. Picture yourself as the head of a two-car family, a conventional family hauler, station wagon, and a Scout. You leave the wagon with your wife, who needs its capacity for shopping and ferrying your offspring to and from school, the piano lessons, etc. You, feeling every inch the man in the Marlboro ad, wend your way to work in your rugged He-Man Scout. Comes the weekend, and with wife riding shotgun and the nippers in the back, you're off to the only kind of togetherness that really makes sense. That is, the kind where you and yours are the only humans for umpteen miles around. This is where the International Harvester Scout shined, as really a weekender, the ultimate vehicle for camping and exploring, whether alone or with the family. This was something the Jeep CJ5 could never do. And in that sense, it existed as exactly what an SUV should be, a sort of in-between vehicle, in between, a pure off-roader and a touring vehicle, a sort of do-it-all automobile. The Scout 80 had its run until 1965. During that time, International updated and expanded the line, releasing models like the Campermobile. Less than 100 of that model were made, however, as it basically fell apart the second you started hitting bumps. The second iteration of the Scout came in 1965 in the form of the Scout 800. Mainly this was an up-to-date, more comfortable version of the Scout 80 with things like bucket seats, a redesigned interior, but most importantly, the Scout was finally offered in 1968 in V8 form. For those of us who long for a time in which most of us never actually lived, but a time when cars were smaller in stature but bigger in personality, this is the Scout to have, this V8 Scout 800 in my opinion. It's not that the little Slant 4 wasn't a great engine. By the time the V8 option rolled around, International had way improved the little 4 to make close to 100 horsepower, which is really impressive. But there was a problem. The market that International had created with this 4x4 was outpacing them. It wasn't just farmers or off-road enthusiasts who wanted these kinds of vehicles. Everybody wanted them, and so making them more usable and more friendly as daily drivers was really what became key. This included things like windshield washers and hazard lights, improved heating and defrosting, and my personal favorite, a padded dash. But in '67, the biggest change so far would come in the form of a 266 cubic inch V8, making about 155 horsepower and 227 foot-pounds of torque. On paper, this made it competitive with the best version of Ford's all-new Scout copycat, the Ford Bronco. For the 1960s, the Scout was a runaway success. This was the Scout's decade. This individual model from IH outsold all of Jeep's sales for the 1960s, but as the decade closed, everyone making sport utility vehicles was pushing to make their options more usable and more powerful. Much like today, bigger unfortunately meant better, and the time came for IH to revamp the Scout completely if they were going to survive this new market. Now, the Scout 2 came about later than International initially wanted. They'd been planning this vehicle since back in the mid-60s, hoping to get it out around 67, but it wouldn't come out until 1971. During the 60s, most of their resources were being pulled into just updating the existing Scout just to stay up with the competition. The Scout II, though, was in many ways a response to the 1969 Chevy Blazer, built on their existing C10 truck line. The Blazer was, in many eyes, bigger and better than all of the other sport utility vehicles out there, including the first-gen Scouts and Broncos. It was, in short, a much better family vehicle than those options, and it could still go off-road, but let's face it, the Blazer was and would go on to become much more of a road vehicle than an off-road vehicle. I mean, look at how it was marketed at this time. All the comfort and nice things of a family car, but all the handiness and toughness of a pickup truck. International had to stay relevant, so they took the Scout to the next level with the Scout II. Now, the Scout II's overall wheelbase was the same, but it was roomier. The standard rear seat folded down for more cargo space. It had an entirely reworked interior styling, a new grille, it sat 3 inches lower than the previous Scout, and had custom packages with stuff like tinted windows. The Scout II also had a fully synchronized and automatic gearbox during its run. In V8 form, the Scout II was pushing 200 horsepower. It had fantastic towing capacity. And what's interesting about the Scout II was how it stayed true to its original identity, unlike so many other 4x4s in the 70s. In terms of this market, this new budding SUV market, it was still targeted more as a 4x4 off-road vehicle versus the sort of family car that the big competitors were making. The Scout would have its day, however. By the late 70s, the writing was really on the wall for International. A massive strike at the company, coupled with a stubborn response from the company, alongside waning sales, would end the Scout's run, and ultimately the company's run, as an automotive manufacturer. The other options from the major manufacturers were just better for what the average driver wanted. But of the larger 4x4s that came out in the 70s and 80s, the Scout II is one of the most collectible and interesting because it held on to that identity as a true off-road vehicle, whereas most of the bigger manufacturers, and even Jeep, moved to making their large 4x4s essentially luxury family vehicles. If you want a vintage 4x4 that actually has some chops off-road, the Scout II is the one to get. Now, it's important to understand as we think about what SUVs would become, especially from, the late 70s onward, it's important to understand what these SUVs were. For the early Jeep CJs and early Scouts and early Broncos, these were not big vehicles, and even by today's standards, those later SUVs like the Scout II and even the Chevy Blazer, those were even small vehicles compared to today. It's easy to think, cars were just smaller at that time. And of course, some of them were, especially British cars, but American vehicles were not small through the 50s and 60s. The Scout was considered small for its time because small vehicles are generally better off-road. I mean, just look at the Suzuki Samurai and its ability to destroy most large off-road vehicles in its day, and even today. These first SUVs weren't just smaller, they were true sporting machines that people actually used to take on adventures. They weren't family vehicles bought because people think they're safer just because they're bigger, which, by the way, is not even true. These original 4x4s were purchased by people who needed them to be rugged, whether that meant getting you and maybe your family out to that remote spot to camp, and you needed a durable, reliable 4x4, or maybe you needed something for around the farm to haul feed or hay or plow snow. When one ponders the very meaning of the term SUV, it becomes difficult to see how today's massive luxury rigs fit into this category at all anymore. We can blame vehicles like the Jeep Wagoneer, but it goes all the way back to the 70s as companies like International fought to survive in a market that should have never went mainstream. I'm not saying that many of today's SUVs aren't capable. I mean, even look at Whistling Diesel's G-Wagon tests. But for most SUV owners, where's the actual sport? What sport is, the soccer mom participating in when she drives her single child to soccer in a car large enough to hold the entire soccer team? In fact, we rarely even categorize the actual SUVs as SUVs today. I mean, who calls a Wrangler an SUV? But a Wrangler is an actual SUV. It actually is a sport utility vehicle, used sometimes at least for off-road purposes. I think that the market is once again ripe for small, affordable, usable but cool vehicles like the Scout was in its day. Wait, what is this? Today, Volkswagen owns International, and apparently they're bringing the Scout back in the form of its own company? Oh my god, I swear if they say it's going to be, oh my god, it's electric. Okay, see you guys in the next one.